On our third wedding anniversary, I cooked his favorite meal, lit candles, and waited for him like an idiot who still believed love could be earned. He came home late, looked at the table, and asked me what it was for. Then his first love called, and my alpha husband left me alone at our anniversary dinner without a second thought. That was the night I asked for a divorce. He signed the papers like I meant nothing. But the moment I stopped loving him was the moment he started losing his mind. The first time I realized my marriage was dying, Lucien didn't say anything cruel. He just forgot. I stood in the dining room with both hands wrapped around the back of a chair, staring at the candlelit table I had spent 2 hours preparing. The food was still warm. The wine had already been opened. And the tiny velvet box hidden beneath Lucien's folded napkin suddenly felt so embarrassing I wanted to throw it into the fireplace. 3 years. 3 years of marriage, and I was still stupid enough to wait for him like a wife in love instead of a man with dignity. The front door opened. For one humiliating second, my heart actually lifted. I hated that about myself most. Lucien stepped inside, one hand loosening the knot of his tie, his dark coat still carrying the sharp scent of cold night air and cedar smoke. He looked exactly the way he always did when he came home late, composed, severe, unreachable. His eyes passed over me first, then over the table, then back to me. There was no recognition in them, no memory, no pause. "What is this?" he asked. The words landed softly. That somehow made them worse. I swallowed once. "Dinner." His expression didn't change. I can see that. The room felt too warm all at once. I forced a smile that didn't feel like mine. "I thought we could eat together tonight." Lucien set his phone and keys on the table near the door without looking at me again. "I already ate." That one hurt more than it should have. Or maybe less. Maybe I was finally getting used to the shape of pain he always left behind. "I can warm something else," I said quietly. "There's no need." I watched him move through the room like none of this mattered. Like the candles didn't exist. Like the dinner didn't exist. Like I didn't. My fingers tightened around the chair. He reached for the glass decanter beside the bar cabinet, pouring himself a drink with the same detached precision he brought to everything else in his life. Business. Family. Reputation. Coldness. I used to think if I was patient enough, gentle enough, good enough, one day he would turn and really see me. 3 years later, I was beginning to understand something much uglier. Lucien had seen me all along. He just never chose to care. "Lucien," I said before I could stop myself. He glanced at me over the rim of his glass. I hated how one look from him could still make my pulse stumble. "Yes." I opened my mouth. What had I wanted to say? "Do you remember? Do you know what day it is? Do you realize I still keep trying even when you keep crushing me with the same indifferent hands?" Instead, what came out was smaller. Weaker. "You're very late." Lucien lowered the glass. "There was a meeting." "Until 10 at night?" His gaze sharpened slightly. "If you're trying to start something, Kaylin, I'm not in the mood." I went still. There it was. Not shouting. Not anger. Just that familiar, clean little slice of dismissal. I looked down at the table before he could see the expression on my face. The silverware gleamed under candlelight. The white flowers I had arranged myself were already beginning to droop at the edges. It was ridiculous, the things that broke your heart in the end. Not the obvious betrayals. The flowers. The untouched food. The silence. Then Lucien's phone rang. My chest tightened before I even looked. He pulled it from his pocket, frowned at the screen for half a second, then answered immediately. "Adrian." Something in me turned to ice. I didn't mean to react. But Lucien's eyes flicked toward me anyway. Not guilty. Just annoyed that I had noticed. I looked away first. That was dignity, I told myself. Or maybe cowardice. I stood there in silence while he listened to the voice on the other end of the call. At first, his expression remained unreadable. Then it changed. Not much. Just enough. The slight tension in his shoulders. The sharpened focus in his gaze. The immediate shift in his attention. It was always like this with Adrian. Lucien could be made of stone with me. But one tremor in Adrian's voice, and suddenly there was life in him. "What happened?" Lucien asked, already setting his glass down. His voice had changed too. Still calm. Still controlled. But softer. I stared at the candle flame in front of me so hard my vision blurred. I didn't want to hear the rest. But I heard it anyway. "No, stay where you are," Lucien said. "I'll come get you." Something hot and humiliating climbed up my throat. He was already reaching for his keys again. Already leaving. Again. I turned before I could think better of it. You're going out? Lucian looked at me like the question itself was unreasonable. Adrian needs help. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because if I didn't laugh, I thought I might start screaming. Of course he does, I said softly. Lucian's expression cooled further. What is that supposed to mean? Nothing. Then don't say it like that. I looked at him for a long moment. At the man I had married. At the man I had loved so quietly for so long that the silence had started eating me alive from the inside. And suddenly I felt very tired. Not angry. Not dramatic. Just tired. He reached for his coat. That was when I heard myself say it. Only once. Only softly. Do you remember what day it is? Lucian stopped. For a second, hope stabbed through me so sharply it almost stole my breath. He looked at me. Really looked at me. And I knew. I knew from the slight crease between his brows. The blankness. The search. He didn't know. He had no idea. My heart didn't break. It did something worse. It just gave up a little more. Lucian exhaled through his nose, already irritated. Kaylin, it's our anniversary. The words came out so quietly I almost didn't hear them myself. The room went silent. Even the air felt embarrassed for me. Lucian's gaze flicked to the table again. To the candles. To the food. To the box beneath the napkin he had never noticed. Then back to my face. For 1 week, humiliating second, I waited. For an apology. For regret. For anything. Instead, he looked at his phone when it started vibrating again. Adrian. Of course. Lucian's jaw tightened. Then he said, You could have reminded me earlier. I didn't move. I don't think I even blinked. Because that was the exact moment something inside me died. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. The way people drowned when they were too tired to keep fighting the current. Lucian either didn't notice or didn't care. Maybe both. I'll make it up to you tomorrow, he said, already slipping his coat back on. Tomorrow. That useless little word people threw at the things they didn't value enough to protect today. I stared at him. At his beautiful, unreadable face. At the man I had once loved enough to destroy myself for. And for the first time in 3 years, I didn't want to ask him to stay. I wanted to know what would happen if I stopped. Lucian stepped toward the door. Lucian. He paused, impatient now. What? My fingers loosened from the chair. My voice was steady when I said, If I asked you to choose tonight, would you? The question seemed to catch him off guard. His expression hardened almost immediately after. That's unfair. A strange numbness spread through me. Unfair. Not cruel. Not angry. Just offended that I had finally asked for something honest. I gave a small nod. I see. Kaylin. No, I said quietly. Go. Adrian needs you. Lucian studied my face for a moment like he was trying to decide whether this was another emotional scene he didn't have time for. Apparently, he decided it wasn't important enough to solve. He opened the door. Cold air slipped inside. Then, without looking back, he said the one thing I think finally broke whatever was left of me. Try not to make a problem out of this when I get home. The door shut behind him. And just like that, he was gone. The house fell silent. Not peaceful. Not calm. Just empty. I stood there for a long time without moving. The candles crackled softly. The food cooled. The wine sat untouched between 2 plates set for a marriage that had never really existed. Slowly, I walked back to the table. I pulled out my chair. And I sat down alone. The cushion across from me stayed empty. I looked at Lucian's untouched plate for so long that my eyes started burning. Then I reached beneath his napkin and took out the velvet box. Inside was a silver tie pin engraved with a tiny, almost invisible phrase on the back. For all the years we still have left. I stared at it until my vision blurred completely. Then I closed the box, set it beside my plate, and laughed once under my breath. It didn't sound like laughter. It sounded like the last thread snapping. I sat there alone on my 3rd wedding anniversary, staring at the seat my husband had left empty for another man. And somewhere in the quiet, with candlelight flickering against polished glass and dying flowers drooping between us, I think I finally stopped hoping. Lucian didn't come home until after 2 in the morning. I knew because I was still awake when the front door opened. Not because I had been waiting for him. I told myself that at least 5 times while sitting in the dark living room, still wearing the same clothes I had worn to dinner, the same shirt that smelled faintly like candle smoke and cooling food and humiliation. But some lies were too thin to hold. The house was silent when he walked in. He loosened his tie as he stepped through the doorway, his coat draped over one arm, his expression tired in that distant, polished way he always wore after dealing with other people's messes. He looked surprised to find me sitting there. Not worried. Just surprised. "You're still awake." I looked at him from the couch, my hands folded loosely in my lap. There had been a time when I would have stood the second he came home. Asked if he had eaten. If he was tired. If Adrian was all right. Tonight, I stayed where I was. "Yes," I said. Lucien glanced toward the dining room. Even from where we sat, the edge of the table was still visible through the open archway. One candle had burned itself into a pool of hardened wax. The flowers had started to wilt. His eyes moved away first. "You should have gone to bed." The words might have sounded gentle from anyone else. From Lucien, they were just another form of dismissal. I tilted my head slightly. "Would that have made this less embarrassing for you?" His jaw tightened. "Kaylin." There was warning in my name. A quiet one. The kind he used when he thought I was about to become inconvenient. Normally, that was enough to make me retreat. Tonight, something inside me was too tired to be afraid of him. "I'm sorry," I said softly. "You're right. I should have known better than to expect anything." Lucien set his keys down on the console table with a little too much force. "This is exactly why I didn't want to have this conversation tonight." I almost smiled. Because that was the thing, wasn't it? He always acted like pain only became real once it interrupted him. I stood slowly from the couch. The room swayed for half a second before settling again. Lucien noticed. His gaze sharpened slightly. "Have you eaten?" The question was so absurd I nearly laughed. I stared at him. Then I asked, "Did Adrian?" A flicker of irritation crossed his face. "This isn't about Adrian." My expression didn't change. "Everything is about Adrian." Lucien exhaled through his nose, already losing patience. He was stranded, Kaylin. His car was surrounded by reporters, and he was having a panic attack. "What exactly did you expect me to do?" I looked at him for a long moment. What did I expect him to do? Choose me once, maybe. Just once. "Nothing," I said. And somehow that made him more uncomfortable than if I'd shouted. His gaze dropped briefly to my face, then shifted away again. I knew what I looked like. Pale. Tired. Still dressed for an anniversary dinner that had ended in silence. Pathetic, probably. But for the first time, I couldn't find the energy to be ashamed of it. Lucien rubbed a hand over the back of his neck. "I said I'd make it up to you. Tomorrow." There it was again. That useless little graveyard where all the things he didn't care enough to protect went to rot. "Don't," I said quietly. His eyes flicked back to mine. "What? Don't make it up to me tomorrow." A pause. Then, carefully, "What does that mean?" I looked at him. Really looked at him. At the man I had spent 3 years orbiting like some starving thing desperate for warmth. At the husband who could read a room full of investors in 10 seconds, but somehow never noticed when his own marriage was dying in front of him. And suddenly, I didn't feel angry. I felt finished. "It means," I said softly, "I don't want another apology you don't mean." Something in Lucien's face hardened. "That's unfair." There it was again. Unfair. It was always unfair the moment I stopped bleeding quietly. "You forgot our anniversary," I said. His jaw tightened. "I said I was sorry. You left me alone at our anniversary dinner to pick up another man. Adrian needed help. You remembered him immediately." That landed. I saw it in the way his expression shifted. Not guilt exactly, but something close enough to make his shoulders go rigid. For 1 second, I thought maybe this would be the moment. The one where he finally understood. Then he said, "You're turning this into something bigger than it is." And just like that, whatever had almost happened died. I looked at him in silence. Not because I didn't have anything to say. Because I had too much. Because if I opened my mouth, 3 years would come pouring out of me all at once, and I wasn't sure I would survive hearing myself say it aloud. Lucien must have mistaken my silence for surrender. He stepped closer, his voice cooler now, more measured. "Kaylin, I know you're upset. But this level of dramatics over one dinner." "One dinner." He stopped. That was the first time I had interrupted him in months. Maybe years. The room went still around us. I stared at him, my pulse suddenly loud in my ears. "One dinner." I repeated, quieter this time. Lucien's expression closed. And for some reason, that made me smile. Not because it was funny. Because it hurt so much I could feel something inside me splitting open. "You really don't know," I whispered. His brows drew together. Know what? I took one step back from him. Then another, as if distance might somehow make breathing easier. It was never about tonight. Lucien said nothing, maybe because he could hear it in my voice, that this was no longer a conversation either of us could walk back from. I laughed softly under my breath and turned away from him, pressing one hand to my mouth for a second before forcing it back down. Do you know what I used to do? I asked, still facing away. What? I used to stay awake during my heats because I was afraid to fall asleep alone. The silence behind me sharpened. I kept going before I could stop myself. I used to sit outside your office door with tea after your meetings because your assistant once mentioned you got headaches when you skipped lunch. Still silence. I memorized your coffee order, your medication schedule, which shirts you wear when you're stressed, which expression means you're tired, and which one means you're angry enough to break something. My voice cracked slightly on the last word. I hated that. I hated that even now, I was the only one bleeding. I turned back toward him. Lucien was staring at me now. Really staring. Maybe for the first time all night. I know the sound of your footsteps, I said quietly. I know when you're about to leave a room before you even touch the door. His face had gone unreadable in that dangerous way it did when something finally got under his skin. Kaylin, and after 3 years, I said, cutting over him, you still looked at our anniversary table and asked me what it was for. That did it. That one landed. I saw it, in the slight tension around his mouth. The way his throat moved once. The way his hands, always so controlled, had gone still at his sides. Good. He should feel it, even if only for 1 second. I didn't realize, he began. I laughed again. This time it sounded uglier. No, I said. You didn't. The house went silent after that. Too silent. The kind that made every breath feel exposed. Lucien took a step toward me. You're exhausted. We can talk in the morning. Tomorrow. Again. Always tomorrow. I looked at him, and something in me finally snapped clean. Not violently. Not loudly. Just completely. No, I said. His brows knit together. No. No, I repeated, my voice suddenly very calm. We're talking now. That seemed to catch him off guard. Lucien was used to me yielding. Softening. Retreating before things got uncomfortable. I had spent years making myself easier to live with. Smaller. Quieter. Less demanding. And look how well that had worked. I walked past him toward the hallway cabinet where I kept old mail, household files, and things too important to lose. My fingers didn't shake until I touched the folder. Even then, only slightly. Lucien turned as I pulled it free. What are you doing? I didn't answer immediately. I walked back into the living room, set the folder down on the glass coffee table between us, and slid the papers out. Lucien looked down, then back up at me. His face changed so little most people wouldn't have noticed. I did, because I had spent years studying him the way people studied weather before a storm. Kaylin, he said slowly. I met his eyes. My voice came out steady. I want a divorce. The room didn't just go quiet. It emptied, like the air itself had been pulled out of it. Lucien stared at me. For a second, I thought maybe he hadn't heard me. Then his expression flattened into something colder. Not hurt. Not panic. Not fear. Just disbelief mixed with irritation. You're serious? It wasn't a question. Yes. He looked down at the papers again, then back at me, and I saw the exact moment he made the mistake that would ruin him later. He thought I didn't mean it. He thought this was grief speaking. Loneliness. A wounded Omega reaching for the one thing sharp enough to get his attention. He thought I was bluffing. Lucien let out a slow breath and rubbed his jaw with one hand. This is because of tonight. I said nothing, because if I started listing everything this was because of, we would still be standing here by sunrise. It's not a good idea to make permanent decisions when you're emotional. That one almost made me smile. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. After everything, he still thought my pain had started tonight. I've been emotional for 3 years, I said softly. I'm just done now. His gaze sharpened. Something about those words hit harder than the divorce itself. Good. Let them. Lucien picked up the first page. His eyes moved over the text quickly, efficiently, like he was reviewing a business contract instead of the death certificate of our marriage. And that was the moment I knew I was doing the right thing. Because no one should have to beg to be chosen by the person who promised to stay. No one should have to stand in the ruins of their own love and still ask for scraps. Lucien set the papers down. then looked at me with that same unreadable expression he wore whenever he thought other people were being irrational. "You're overreacting." I stared at him. And just like that, the last piece of me that had still loved him enough to hope finally went still. Maybe it died. Maybe it just shut down to survive. Either way, I felt the difference. "I see," I said quietly. Lucien frowned slightly, like he hadn't expected me to go calm. That was the thing about people who were used to your pain. They noticed its absence faster than its presence. He tapped the papers once against the table. Then, in the same detached tone he might have used to approve a transfer or sign off on a merger, he said, "If this is what you want." He reached for the pen. And signed. Just like that. No fight. No hesitation. No wait. No, don't do this. Just ink sliding across paper in clean, elegant strokes. My whole body went cold. Not because I was shocked. Some part of me had expected this. Still, expecting the knife didn't make it hurt less when it finally went in. Lucien set the pen down and pushed the papers back toward me. "There," he said. Like he had solved something. Like he had completed a task. Like my heart had not just stopped beating in my chest. I looked down at his signature for a long time. Long enough for the letters to blur. Then I picked the papers up carefully, as if they were fragile enough to tear. Maybe they were. Maybe I was. Lucien watched me, irritation and restraint warring in his expression. He still didn't understand. He still thought this was temporary. A punishment. A scene. A dramatic gesture that would cool by morning. "You should sleep," he said at last. "We'll talk when you've calmed down." I looked up at him slowly. And for the first time since I had met him, I saw him clearly. Not the man I loved. Not the husband I kept trying to save. Just a stranger in my home wearing the face of someone I had ruined myself for. A man so certain I would stay that he had signed the papers with barely a blink. And suddenly, I felt something close to peace. Cold, maybe, but clean. "No," I said softly. Lucien's expression tightened. "No what?" "No more talking." He opened his mouth. Then stopped. Because there was something in my face now that hadn't been there before. Not anger. Not pleading. Not heartbreak. Just absence. I stepped around the coffee table and moved past him toward the stairs. My voice was calm when I said, "I'll have my things moved by the end of the week." That finally made him turn fully toward me. "Kaylin." I stopped at the bottom step but didn't look back. He was silent for a second too long. Then, "You're leaving?" I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because of course. Of course that was the part that surprised him. I looked over my shoulder and gave him the quietest truth I had left. "You already left first." Then I went upstairs. And this time, I didn't wait for him to follow. I moved out 2 days later. Lucien wasn't home when I left. Some cruel, stupid part of me had expected him to be. Not to stop me. That would have required him to care in ways he had never once proven he could. But maybe to stand there. Maybe to ask where I was going. Maybe to finally look at me like losing me meant something. Instead, the house was empty. Just like it had always been, really. It only felt different now, because I had finally stopped pretending emptiness and loneliness were the same thing. The movers worked quietly. I had packed most of my personal things the night before. Clothes, books, documents, a few gifts from my parents, the small ceramic teacup my mother had insisted would make married life feel warmer. It hadn't. I left almost everything else behind. The expensive furniture had never been mine. The wedding portraits had never felt like us. Even the bedroom had always carried more of Lucien's coldness than anything soft enough to belong to me. When I walked through the house one last time, I didn't cry. That surprised me. I thought I would. I thought maybe I'd break in the doorway or lose myself somewhere between the staircase and the kitchen island where I used to wait for him with tea. Instead, all I felt was tired. A clean kind of tired. Like the body after surviving a fever. Something weak but healing. My driver loaded the last suitcase into the car. I stood on the front steps of the Vale estate and looked back once. The windows reflected a pale afternoon sky. The black iron gates stood open. The front door remained untouched behind me. No one came out. No one called my name. No one said wait. I got in the car. And I left. Lucien came home to silence that evening. At first, he didn't notice it. Or maybe he did and refused to name it. The front door opened. His shoes crossed the marble entryway. His coat was draped over the arm of the nearest chair, without the usual pause where I would have stepped in to take it from him. He loosened his tie with one hand and reached automatically for his phone with the other, eyes still scanning an email when he called out, "Kalen." No answer. He frowned. Not because he was worried, because the lack of response felt inconvenient. He walked farther inside, expecting to find me in one of my usual places. The kitchen, the sitting room, the upstairs library nook where I liked to read when the house got too quiet. Nothing. Lucien set his phone down at last. "Kalen." Still nothing. The silence in the house seemed to sharpen. It wasn't just quiet. It was missing something. He stood in the middle of the foyer, dark brows drawing together slightly as his alpha instincts caught on to the first thing his mind hadn't yet admitted. My scent was gone. Not completely. Not yet. There were traces of it lingering in corners of the house. White tea and winter jasmine, soft and familiar, clinging faintly to the air and fabric and old routines. But the living warmth of it was gone. The active presence. The thing that made a space feel occupied. Lucien looked toward the staircase. Then toward the dining room. Then finally toward the kitchen. He found Mara there instead. The housekeeper was standing at the counter with a folded linen cloth in one hand, freezing visibly when she saw him. Lucien's expression cooled instantly. "Where is Kalen?" Mara hesitated. And that alone irritated him. Lucien was not a man used to hesitation inside his own house. "Sir," she said carefully, "Master Kalen left this afternoon." Lucien went still. Not dramatically. Just all at once. "What?" Mara lowered her gaze. "His things were moved out today." Lucien stared at her, then laughed once under his breath. A dry, humorless sound. "No." Mara looked even more uncomfortable. "He said he would be staying at the Ashford residence for now." For a second, Lucien said nothing. Then he reached into his coat pocket for his phone, jaw tightening as he scrolled quickly through his unread messages. Nothing from me. No update. No location. No explanation. No dramatic paragraph begging him to understand. No emotional collapse. Just absence. His face darkened. He didn't tell me. Mara's silence was answer enough. Lucien's gaze lifted slowly. And though his expression remained controlled, something in the air shifted hard enough that even Mara seemed to feel it. Because yes, I had told him. He had simply never believed me. Lucien turned without another word and walked upstairs. His pace was measured, controlled, but there was something too sharp in it now. Something beginning to crack. He pushed open the bedroom door and stopped. The room was neat. Too neat. His side remained untouched in its usual dark order. Watch on the dresser, books aligned, tie rack organized. My side looked hollow. The small tray where I kept my rings and hair ties was gone. The books from my nightstand had disappeared. The soft gray blanket I always draped over the reading chair had been folded and removed. The room didn't look destroyed. That would have been easier. It looked edited, like someone had carefully erased themselves line by line. Lucien walked farther inside. Opened the wardrobe. Half empty. Opened the bathroom drawers. Cleared. The white ceramic cup I used for tea before bed was gone from the vanity tray. That was the first thing that hit him. Not the clothes. Not the paperwork. The cup. Because it was small. Stupid. Forgettable. And yet it had always been there. The kind of detail a man only noticed once it vanished. Lucien shut the drawer harder than necessary. He told himself this was temporary. That I was upset. That I was making a point. That I would calm down after a few days and come back once the emotional theatrics had burned out. Yes. That was reasonable. That was likely. That was what made sense. So why did the room suddenly feel hard to breathe in? Lucien stepped back from the vanity and loosened his tie again, though he had already done it downstairs. His pulse was wrong. Not elevated enough to call panic. Not calm enough to call normal. Just wrong. He looked toward the bed, and only then noticed the envelope on his pillow. Plain white. Folded once. His name written across the front in my careful handwriting. Lucien stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No tears. No smudged ink. No desperate emotional plea. Just a list. At the top I had written, "Things you'll need to remember now that I'm gone." Lucien's brows pulled together. Then his eyes moved down the page. "Your 8 a.m. blood pressure medication is in the second drawer of the kitchen island, left side. You forget to eat lunch when your meetings run too long, so I asked Mara to start leaving food in your office refrigerator by noon. Your black cufflinks are in the study, not the bedroom. You took them off there last Thursday, that if your shoulder starts hurting again, the heating wrap is in the linen closet. The tailor is delivering your navy suit on Friday. You have a board dinner next Tuesday. Don't wear the gray tie. Chairman Hales hates it. You are allergic to the flowers Adrian keeps sending during spring. I told the florist to stop including them in arrangements, but you may want to remind them. Lucian stopped reading. The room had gone so quiet he could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. He looked back at the page, at the neat handwriting, at the stupid, domestic little details, at the careful way I had still made sure his life would run smoothly. Even while leaving him, something shifted low and unpleasant in his chest. Not guilt. Not yet. Something more irritating. More invasive. Something like being seen too clearly by a ghost. Lucian folded the paper once, then unfolded it again. At the bottom, in smaller writing, there was one final line. I know you won't notice most of these things right away. You never noticed me right away either. Lucian stared at the sentence until it blurred slightly. Then he set the paper down too fast and stepped away from the bed like distance could make the words less true. His jaw was tight enough to hurt. He reached for his phone. Called me. Straight to voicemail. He frowned harder and tried again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. Something dark and immediate moved through him then. Not fear. Not yet. Anger. How dare I ignore him? How dare I leave, then make myself unreachable? How dare I be the one to decide when the silence began and ended? Lucian gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles whitened. Then stopped, because beneath the anger was something worse. Something far more humiliating. He had no idea where I was sleeping tonight. No idea if I had eaten. No idea whether I had cried. No idea whether I was safe, warm, alone, or already beginning to heal in a place that no longer included him. And for the first time since signing the papers, the thought didn't irritate him. It unsettled him. Lucian lowered the phone slowly. The room around him felt colder than it should have. He crossed to the wardrobe again and opened the far left drawer almost on instinct. Inside were the things I had forgotten. Or maybe the things I had chosen not to take. A silk sleep mask. A pair of folded gloves. A slim leather notebook. And beneath them, a small velvet box. Lucian's hand paused, then closed around it. His chest tightened before he even opened it. Inside was the tie pin. Silver. Elegant. Minimal. The kind of gift he would have actually worn. Lucian turned it over in his hand, and saw the engraving on the back. For all the years we still have left. He stopped breathing for a second. Not metaphorically. Actually, the room went still around him. The words sat in his palm like something alive. Something fragile. Something he had crushed without ever bothering to look down first. Lucian's throat moved once. Then again. He closed the box too quickly, as if that could undo the fact that it existed. As if shutting it away could make the image disappear. Me, standing alone in candlelight, still hoping enough to buy him a gift he had never even known was there. His grip tightened. For the first time all night, his control slipped. Just a little. The box snapped shut so hard the sound cracked through the room. And in the silence that followed, Lucian finally understood one unbearable thing. I had not left to punish him. I had left because I was done surviving him. He sat down on the edge of the bed without meaning to. The mattress dipped beneath his weight. The room smelled faintly of old cedar and fading jasmine. And suddenly, for the first time in 3 years, Lucian looked at our bed and saw exactly what it was. Not a marriage. Not a home. Just a place where I had learned how to be lonely beside someone. His hand tightened around the velvet box. His jaw flexed once. Then he looked at the half-empty room and said my name out loud for no one to hear. Kaelin. The silence that answered him felt like punishment. And for the first time, he didn't think he deserved anything else. The first week after I left, Lucian told himself he was giving me space. The second week, he told himself I was being stubborn. By the third, he had stopped lying to himself about one thing. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a punishment built out of marble, glass, and silence. No one reminded him to eat. No one left tea in his study after difficult meetings. No one folded the sleeves of his shirts the way he preferred or noticed when his shoulder ached before he said a word. The strange thing was, Lucian had once believed he liked living that way. Clean. Orderly. Uncomplicated. Now every room in the estate felt too large. Too quiet. Too honest. And worst of all, every missing thing kept proving the same point. I had loved him in 1,000 small ways he had never bothered to count. By the end of the month, Lucian had read my notes so many times the fold line had started to wear thin. He hated himself for that. Almost as much as he hated the fact that he still carried the silver tie pin in his coat pocket, like some pathetic relic from a marriage he had already signed away. He called me often at first, then daily, then obsessively. I never answered. Not once. At some point, he stopped leaving messages. Not because he had run out of things to say, because he had finally realized he had never truly learned how to speak to me at all. I didn't know any of this at the time, and even if I had, I don't think it would have changed anything. Pain had a way of clarifying people. Once the first few days of numbness wore off, I found something stranger waiting underneath. Peace. Not happiness. Not yet. But peace. The kind that came from waking up and not having to spend the first 10 seconds of consciousness bracing myself for disappointment. I had moved into one of my family's smaller residences on the edge of the city, a quiet townhouse with pale walls, too many windows, and a garden my mother insisted would help settle my nerves. I thought that was ridiculous, until I found myself sitting beside the roses every morning with tea in both hands, staring into the cool air like someone who had survived a war and still wasn't sure whether the silence afterward could be trusted. The divorce was moving faster than I expected. Lucien's legal team hadn't contested anything. That should have made it easier. Instead, it left behind a sour kind of ache. Even now, some wounded part of me still noticed how quickly he had let me go. I hated that part of myself. But healing, I was beginning to learn, was not elegant. It was ugly and repetitive and deeply unfair. Some mornings I felt lighter. Some mornings I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and still looked like a man who had once begged too long to be loved. That was the version of me I was trying to bury. And slowly, very slowly, I was succeeding. The first time Lucien panicked, it happened at a charity gala. The kind of polished, expensive event our families had attended for years. Gold lights. Crystal chandeliers. Political smiles sharpened like knives. Normally, I would have stood at Lucien's side through something like that, quiet and decorative and useful. Tonight, I arrived alone. And for the first time in a very long time, I did not feel like an accessory. I had almost not gone. My mother had argued. My sister had threatened to drag me herself. In the end, I came mostly because I was tired of making myself smaller in rooms where I had every right to stand. So I wore black. Simple. Elegant. Sharp enough to make me feel like I had bones again. By the time I stepped into the ballroom, conversations were already flowing around me in warm, expensive currents. A few people noticed me immediately. That was expected. A recently separated Omega from a high-profile marriage was the kind of thing social circles fed on for sport. I ignored them. Or tried to. My pulse had just begun to settle when a familiar voice beside me said, "If you grip your glass any harder, they'll think you're planning a murder." I turned and blinked. "Rowan," he smiled, and for one stunned second, I almost cried from the sheer shock of being looked at gently. Rowan Ashford was one of my older brother's closest friends. An alpha, 32, calm where most alphas were forceful, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, and carrying that rare kind of quiet confidence that didn't need to announce itself to dominate a room. I hadn't seen him in almost 2 years, mostly because after my marriage, I had stopped showing up anywhere that felt too alive. "You remember me," he said lightly. I stared at him. "You used to steal desserts at my parents' winter dinners and blame it on me." Rowan placed one hand over his chest with exaggerated solemnity. And yet somehow our bond survived. I laughed. Actually laughed. The sound startled me so badly, I had to look away for a second. It had been a while. Too long. Rowan noticed. Of course he did. But instead of making it awkward, he simply lifted his glass and said, "There. Proof of life. I was starting to think your family had locked you in a tower." Something in my expression must have shifted, because his own smile faded at the edges. Not fully. Just enough. "Bad joke?" he asked. I swallowed and shook my head. "No. Just not entirely inaccurate." Rowan went still. He didn't press. Didn't demand details. Didn't perform concern like some people did when they smelled tragedy in the air. He just looked at me for one extra second and said, very quietly, "Then I'm glad you're here tonight." The warmth in those words landed in a place I had almost forgotten existed. I looked away first, because if I didn't, I thought I might embarrass myself. Lucien saw me 20 minutes later, and the world inside him tilted so violently he almost dropped his drink. At first, it was just instinct, a familiar scent threading through the crowded ballroom. White tea, winter jasmine, and something softer underneath that his alpha had memorized without permission. His head turned before his thoughts did. Then he saw me, across the room, standing beneath the chandelier light, dressed in black, laughing. Lucien stopped moving. For one strange second, nothing around him made sense. Because the man standing across the ballroom did not look like the version of me he had left behind. I did not look hollow. I did not look broken. I did not look like I had spent weeks drowning in the ruins he had made of me. I looked different. Not healed. Not fully. But alive in a way that made something ugly tear through his chest. Then Lucien saw who I was standing with. And everything inside him went cold. Rowan Ashford. Tall. Alpha. Old money. Controlled enough to be dangerous. Lucien knew him by reputation. Worse, he knew exactly what kind of man Rowan was. Steady. Protective. Well-liked. The sort of alpha older Omegas whispered about as if he had been custom-built by a god who actually listened. Lucien's fingers tightened around his glass. Across the room, Rowan leaned down slightly to hear something I said. I smiled again, and Lucien felt something black and immediate twist under his ribs. No, absolutely not. The thought came so fast and so irrationally that it startled even him. He was moving before he fully decided to. One step, then another. Then across half the ballroom with his pulse pounding too hard and too fast to be mistaken for anything but instinct. Possession. Jealousy. Panic. By the time he reached us, my smile was gone. Of course it was. I looked up and froze. For a second, no one spoke. Then Rowan's expression cooled by several precise degrees. Lucien barely noticed. His attention was locked entirely on me, on the slight tension in my shoulders, the way my hand tightened around the stem of my glass, the way my scent shifted almost imperceptibly, not fear exactly, but discomfort. And somehow that hurt him too, because once, not that long ago, my body had softened whenever he entered a room. Now it braced. Kaelin, Lucien said. My name came out lower than intended. Rougher. Possessive enough that Rowan noticed immediately. I saw it in the way his gaze sharpened. I lifted my chin slightly. Lucien. The formality of it struck like a slap. Lucien's jaw flexed. His eyes moved over my face as if searching for something. An opening, maybe. A weakness. A sign that this wasn't real. Instead, all he found was distance. It made his pulse kick harder. Rowan, ever gracious, said, "Good evening." Lucien looked at him then, and every alpha instinct in his body recoiled. Because Rowan was standing too close. Because Rowan's attention was too settled on me. Because Rowan looked at me the way a man looked at something he considered worth protecting. Lucien had never wanted to hit another man more in his life. Instead, he said too evenly, "I wasn't aware you knew my husband." The silence that followed was surgical. I felt it cut through me before anyone else moved. Rowan's expression didn't change. But I saw the exact second he understood what kind of man Lucien truly was. My fingers went cold around my glass. Then I looked Lucien directly in the eye and said very calmly, "You don't get to call me that anymore." The air around us changed. Lucien went still. Not socially still. Not polished, public mask still. The other kind. The dangerous kind. I had seen it only a handful of times in our marriage, always when something struck too close to his control. His gaze locked onto mine with an intensity so sharp it nearly felt physical. "Kaelin," he said again. This time it sounded like a warning. I felt Rowan shift slightly beside me. Not stepping in. Just positioning himself enough to remind Lucien that I was not standing here alone. The effect was immediate. Lucien's expression darkened. "Would you excuse us?" he asked Rowan. It wasn't a request. Rowan smiled slightly. The kind of smile men used before duels. "That depends," he said. "Would he like to be excused with you?" Lucien's face changed. Not much, but enough. Enough for my pulse to skip. Enough for me to realize, with a strange, distant clarity, that this was the first time in years anyone had ever bothered to ask what I wanted in front of Lucien. Not what was practical. Not what would avoid conflict. Not what would keep the evening smooth. What I wanted. And maybe that should not have felt revolutionary. But it did. I looked at Rowan. Then at Lucien. And in that moment, I understood something very simple. I was done being handled. "I'm fine," I said. Lucien's gaze snapped back to me. "That's not what I asked. A month ago, that tone would have made me shrink. Tonight, it only made me tired." "No," I said quietly. "You don't ask. That's been the problem all along. The words landed harder than I intended. Lucien's expression didn't crack. But I watched something flash behind his eyes. Shock, maybe. Or the first ugly shape of self-recognition. Either way, it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. I set my untouched glass on a passing tray and stepped back. Not dramatically. Not cruelly. Just with finality. "I'm not doing this here," I said. Then I turned to Rowan. "Would you walk with me?" His answer came without hesitation. Of course. Lucien actually moved. Just half a step. But it was there. That raw, involuntary lurch of a man watching something leave his reach too fast to stop. Kalen. My name sounded wrong in his mouth now. Too late. Too heavy. Too human. I paused. Only because some old instinct in me still answered when he called. Then I looked back over my shoulder. Lucien stood in the middle of the ballroom beneath the gold lights, perfect and composed and quietly unraveling. For one suspended second, his eyes met mine. And I saw it. Not love. Not redemption. Something much uglier. The dawning horror of a man realizing the person he had treated as permanent was no longer standing still for him. Good. Let it hurt. He had earned every second of it. My voice was calm when I said, "Please don't follow me." Then I walked away. This time Lucien didn't. Maybe because he still had too much pride. Maybe because the room was full of witnesses. Or maybe because some part of him had finally understood that if he reached for me now, I would pull away. And for Lucien Vale, that was the first true panic of his life. Later that night, when the gala had long ended and the city had gone dark, Lucien sat alone in his study with my name burning behind his ribs like a wound. He poured a drink and didn't touch it. Took off his tie and left it draped over the chair. Read the same 3 unread messages on his phone without absorbing a single word. And all the while, one image kept returning with brutal precision. Me, smiling at another alpha. Not politely. Not socially. But easily. Softly. Like my body had remembered what safety felt like in the space of one conversation. That was what ruined him. Not Rowan's hand near my back. Not the way Rowan had looked at him like he was something to be judged and found lacking. It was the smile. Because Lucien had spent 3 years starving me. And tonight, he had watched another man offer me warmth so effortlessly that I had leaned toward it without even thinking. That realization hollowed something out inside him. For the first time, the possibility became real. Not that I had left, but that I might one day stop loving him enough to hurt. That I might heal. That I might laugh more. Sleep better. Wear black and stand under chandeliers and belong to a life that no longer included him at all. Lucien sat there in the dark until sunrise with the untouched drink beside him and the tie pin in his hand. And somewhere between midnight and morning, he finally understood the shape of his punishment. I was going to survive him, and he was going to have to watch. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. Lucien did not contest a single thing. Not the house settlement. Not the legal terms. Not the financial separation. Not even the final removal of the bond markers from our marital records. On paper, he let me go with perfect efficiency. In reality, he never let go at all. By then, Rowan had become part of my life so gradually that I almost didn't realize when his presence stopped feeling temporary. He never pushed. That was the first thing I noticed. He never demanded my trust like he was owed it. Never touched me without letting me see the movement first. Never spoke to me as if my pain was an inconvenience he had to outlast. He just stayed. Quietly. Steadily. Patient in ways I had never known love could be. At first, I didn't know what to do with that kind of gentleness. I kept waiting for the hidden condition. The coldness after. The distance. The subtle punishment for being difficult to love. It never came. And somehow, that frightened me more than cruelty ever had. Because pain I understood. Kindness, real kindness, felt dangerous when you had spent too long surviving on scraps. Rowan seemed to understand that too. He never called me fragile. Never treated me like a broken thing he had to rescue. He treated me like a person worth learning. That was somehow even harder to survive. The first time I fell asleep on his couch during a rainstorm and woke up with a blanket tucked around me and tea warming on the side table. I cried so hard in his bathroom, I had to sit on the floor for 20 minutes before I could breathe normally again. Not because anything bad had happened. Because nothing had. Because someone had cared for me gently and expected nothing in return. That was how damaged Lucien had left me. And that was how carefully Rowan helped me heal. Piece by piece. Without pride. Without pressure. Without making my recovery about his goodness. Sometimes I think that was when I first started loving him. Not in one dramatic moment, but slowly. The way winter turned into spring when you weren't looking. Lucien, meanwhile, was becoming a ghost in his own life. At first, society called it dignity. He never spoke publicly about the divorce. Never drank himself into scandal. Never lashed out where people could see. He remained Lucien Vale, controlled, elegant, untouchable. Only the people closest to him noticed the damage. His meetings grew shorter. His temper grew thinner. He stopped attending events unless absolutely necessary. And when he did, his gaze had a habit of searching rooms before he seemed aware he was doing it. Searching for me. Sometimes he found me. And every time he did, the result was the same. I looked happier. That was the part he could not survive. Not prettier. Not thinner. Not more polished. Happier. Healthier. As if removing him from my life had let light back into places he had spent years darkening. At first, he told himself it was temporary. That I was performing recovery. That I would eventually realize moving on was not the same as healing. Then he saw me with Rowan enough times to understand the truth. I was not pretending. I was becoming someone else. Someone softer in the right ways. Stronger in the important ones. Someone who no longer looked over his shoulder every time a door opened. Someone who had finally learned what safety felt like. And Lucien had not been the one to give it to me. That knowledge rotted him from the inside. A year after the divorce, Rowan proposed. He did it quietly. At home. No audience. No spectacle. Just a winter evening, low firelight, and his hands wrapped around mine, as if he already understood the answer mattered more than the performance. "I'm not asking you to heal on my timeline," he said, voice low and steady. "And I'm not asking you to become someone else to make this easier for me." His thumb brushed once over my knuckles. "I'm asking because I love who you are now," he said. "And I think I'll keep loving who you become next." That was the moment I broke. Not elegantly. Not beautifully. I cried so hard I couldn't speak for almost a full minute, and Rowan just sat there holding my hands while I shook apart in front of him like a man finally collapsing in a place where it was safe to fall. "Yes," I whispered eventually. Then, because the word didn't feel big enough. "Yes, please." Rowan smiled in that quiet, devastating way of his and kissed my forehead before slipping the ring onto my finger like it was something sacred. And for the first time in my life, love did not feel like begging. It felt like coming home. Lucien found out through a newspaper announcement. He was in his office when it happened. One of the assistants had left a social page clipping on his desk with the rest of his morning briefing, not realizing what it contained. Or maybe realizing it perfectly. People could be cruel in very polished ways. He saw my name first. Then Rowan's. Then the engagement photograph beneath it. I was smiling. Not politely. Not socially. Not for a camera. I was smiling the way people smiled when they forgot to be guarded. Rowan stood beside me with one hand at the small of my back, and a look on his face Lucien had once convinced himself no one would ever wear for me. Pride. Tenderness. Certainty. Lucien stared at the photograph for so long his assistant knocked twice before he answered. He dismissed the rest of the day's meetings after that. No explanation. No excuse. Just silence. By evening, he was standing outside my townhouse in the rain like a man who had finally run out of lies. I saw him through the front window. Tall. Dark coat. Still as a gravestone beneath the storm. For a long moment, I simply stood there and looked at him. The old version of me, the one who had once starved for scraps of his attention, might have gone numb at the sight. Might have mistaken his presence for proof of love. Now all I felt was something much quieter. Sadness, maybe. Not for myself. For the years I had wasted believing this was all I deserved. Rowan came up behind me and stopped when he saw where I was looking. His voice stayed calm. "Do you want me to send him away?" That question alone almost hurt. Not because I was fragile. Because even now, after everything, being asked what I wanted still felt precious enough to bruise. I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. "I'll do it." Rowan studied my face for a second, then leaned down and kissed my temple once. "I'll be in the kitchen. No suspicion. No possessiveness. No demand to monitor the interaction. Just trust." That too felt like healing. I opened the door. Cold rain-scented air rushed in. Lucien looked at me immediately. And for one long, unbearable second, neither of us spoke. He looked older. Not physically, exactly. But worn in a way expensive suits and perfect posture couldn't hide. His eyes moved over my face like a starving man looking at something he had once thrown away without understanding its value. Kalen, he said. My name sounded rough. Almost unfamiliar. I leaned lightly against the doorframe. You shouldn't be here. Lucian swallowed once. Rain had dampened the edges of his hair. His hands were empty. No umbrella. No car in immediate sight. For a man like him, that alone said enough. He had not planned this carefully. He had simply come apart and ended up here. Good. Let him feel what desperation looked like. I saw the announcement, he said. I nodded once. Yes. Silence. Then quietly. You're marrying him. There was something almost disbelieving in the words. As if some broken, selfish part of him had never truly believed I would belong to a future that didn't include him. I held his gaze. Yes. Lucian's throat moved. Rain tapped steadily against the stone path behind him. Somewhere deeper in the house, I could hear faint movement in the kitchen, dishes, soft footsteps, the ordinary sounds of a life built gently. A life Lucian was standing outside of. A life he would never enter. And I think he knew it. For a second, he just looked at me. Then finally, the thing I had once waited years to hear came out of his mouth. I was wrong. The words landed in the quiet between us. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just late. Painfully, irreparably late. Lucian's jaw tightened once before he forced the rest out. I was wrong about everything. A year ago, that confession might have shattered me. A year ago, I might have mistaken it for salvation. Now I only felt tired. Because understanding after destruction was not redemption. It was just accurate. You were, I said softly. Something in his face flinched. Good. He should hear it plain. Lucian looked down for half a second, then back at me. And when he spoke again, his voice had lost something. Pride, maybe. Or the last illusion that he could still control how this ended. I loved you, he said. The sentence almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny. Because of course. Of course he would finally call it love only after it no longer cost him anything to say. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said the truest thing I had left. No, I replied quietly. You loved the version of me that stayed. Lucian went completely still. Rainwater slid from the edge of his coat to the stone below. I continued before he could interrupt. You loved being certain I would still be there after every disappointment. After every humiliation. After every time you chose someone else and assumed I would survive it quietly. His expression had gone pale now. Tight. Stripped bare in a way I had never seen before. But I didn't stop. Because for once I needed him to hear all of it. You didn't love me when I was lonely, I said. You didn't love me when I was hurting. You didn't love me when I needed you. You only started calling it love when I stopped waiting for it. Lucian's breathing had gone shallow. His voice, when it came, was almost unsteady. Kalen, please. That word. Please. From him. It should have mattered more. It didn't. I am happy now, I said. The sentence came out softer than anything else I had said. Not cruel. Not triumphant. Just true. And somehow that was what destroyed him most. Because he could hear it. I was not saying it to wound him. I was saying it because it was real. Because for the first time in years, my life no longer revolved around surviving someone who called neglect love and regret devotion. Lucian looked at me like the ground beneath him had finally given way. Then his eyes flicked past my shoulder. Just briefly. Toward the warm light inside. Toward the sound of dishes. Toward the life he had not been chosen for. And his face changed. Not with jealousy this time. With understanding. Final, ugly understanding. There was someone inside waiting for me. Someone gentle. Someone steady. Someone who would never leave me sitting alone at a candlelit table and call my heartbreak dramatic afterward. Someone better. Lucian's voice broke slightly when he asked, Do you love him? I could have lied. Could have softened it. Could have chosen mercy. But mercy was a luxury he had buried himself. So I told him the truth. Yes. That was the sound of the last door closing. You could almost hear it in the silence that followed. Lucian didn't move for a long time. Rain kept falling. The porch light glowed warm against the dark. My engagement ring felt solid and real against my hand where it rested against the door. Eventually, Lucian nodded once. A small movement. Almost mechanical. As if his body had gone on functioning after the rest of him had already collapsed. Then he looked at me one last time and said, in a voice so quiet I almost missed it, I'm sorry. And for the first time, I believed he meant it. That was what made it tragic. Not because I wanted him back, but But because he had finally become sincere at the exact moment sincerity no longer had the power to save him. I held his gaze for one final second. Then I gave him the only mercy I had left. "I know," I said. Lucien's eyes closed briefly. Just once. When they opened again, he looked like a man standing in the wreckage of a house he had personally set on fire. There was nothing left to say. So he stepped back, then turned, then walked away into the rain without asking me to stop him. This time I didn't. I closed the door gently behind him. And just like that, Lucien Vale became part of my past. 2 years later, I married Rowan in a private ceremony beneath winter lights and white flowers. There were no politics, no sharp smiles, no cold vows exchanged for appearances. Just family, warm hands, tears, laughter, love spoken aloud without shame. When Rowan looked at me at the altar, his expression held no doubt in it at all. Only certainty, only devotion, only the quiet promise of a life where I would never have to earn tenderness by suffering for it first. That spring, I got pregnant. And when I told Rowan, he stared at me for 3 full seconds before dropping to his knees in front of me in the kitchen, like the news had physically taken his breath. "Are you serious?" he whispered. I laughed through tears and nodded. He made a sound somewhere between a broken laugh and a prayer, then wrapped both arms around my waist and pressed his face against my stomach like he already loved our child enough to shake apart from it. And when he looked up at me, eyes bright, smile helpless, voice trembling, he said, "Thank you for staying long enough to let me love you." That was the moment I knew. Not just that I had moved on, but that I had finally arrived in the life I was meant to have. Our daughter was born in autumn. A year later, our son followed. The house grew louder after that. Messier. Warmer. Alive in all the ways I had once thought were impossible for me. There were toys beneath sofas. Tiny socks disappearing into impossible places. Crayon marks on one hallway wall Rowan swore he would clean and never did. There was laughter in the kitchen. Warm bodies in bed on winter mornings. Small hands reaching for me with absolute trust. There was love everywhere. Not painful love. Not starving love. Not the kind that taught you to survive abandonment and call it devotion. Real love. The kind that stayed. The kind that built. The kind that made a family instead of a wound. And sometimes on very quiet nights, I would sit in the nursery doorway and watch Rowan asleep with one of our children on his chest and think, This was what I had been begging the wrong man for all along. Lucien never married. There were rumors, of course. Possible matches. Strategic introductions. Elegant women and Omegas from powerful families who might have fit neatly into the shape of his life. None of them lasted. Not because Lucien was still noble enough to spare them. Because none of them were me. And for the rest of his life, that became his private punishment. Not dramatic grief. Not public ruin. Just the slow, permanent horror of knowing he had once held something irreplaceable in his hands. And crushed it through neglect before he even understood it was alive. Years later, he would still pause at white tea. Still stop when he caught winter jasmine on strangers in crowded places. Still wake some nights with the vivid memory of candlelight on silver cutlery and a quiet voice asking, "Do you remember what day it is?" And every single time, the answer would come too late. Just like everything else.